Chapter 1. The rolling hills continued endlessly. Boulders were prominent, grass and trees were few. The road wound thinly between the hills, frequently becoming so narrow that even the single cart was enough to block it entirely. Just when it seemed the climbing would continue forever, the road turned down, and the seemingly endless naked rocks and dried shrubs suddenly changed to a wide, awaiting vista. While the journey had been more interesting than endless grass plains, most anyone would find the travel tiresome by the 5th day. From the road, tinged with a loneliness that suggested the coming winter, the voice that once sounded its delight at the undulations of the stony ochre path was now gone. Its owner was now apparently too bored to even sit on the bench of the cart. She lay instead in the bed, grooming the fur of her tail. A young man drove the cart, apparently used to such selfish behavior on the part of his companion. The man, Kraft Lawrence, was instantly recognizable as a traveling merchant. This year made the 7th since he'd struck out on his own, and he appeared to be around 25. As if in acknowledgment of the chill that came with the deepening autumn, he tightened the fur coat that was wrapped around his body. Occasionally, the chill also caused him to stroke his chin, covered in the sort of beard one often saw on traveling merchants, since when he sat still, he became slightly cooler. Letting a breath escape that would have turned foggy once the sun set, Lawrence glanced over his shoulder at the bed of the cart. Normally filled to the brim with various goods, the bed was enjoying a brief respite. All that stood out was the firewood and straw that provided warmth at night, along with a single bag, small enough for a child to carry. However, the contents of the bag were more valuable than an entire cart full of wheat would have been. The bag was full of high-grade pepper worth roughly 1,000 silver trenny. If it could be sold in a mountain town, it might fetch as much as 1,700 pieces, but the bag was currently being used as a pillow by Lawrence's companion, who continued lazily grooming her tail. She was small, with a face that was somehow imperious despite its apparent youth, reminiscent of a queen relaxing in her palace. The hood of her robe was thrown back, exposing her pointed ears as she attended to her tail, her expression listless. Given the tail, the pointed ears, and the fact of her status as a merchant's traveling companion, one might reasonably think of a dog, but unfortunately, she was no dog. She was apparently a wise wolf, a wolf god from the taiga in the distant north. But Lawrence felt there was some question as to whether she could be properly called a wolf. After all, this wolf appeared to be a young girl. Calling her a wolf seemed highly inaccurate. "We'll be reaching the town soon. Be careful," he said. It would be disastrous for the girl's ears and tail to be seen by others. The truth was, her canniness would put the instincts of even the sharpest merchant to shame. Thus Lawrence didn't need to warn her of the danger. However, she was so thoroughly relaxed that he simply had to speak up. Not so much as glancing at him, she only yawned hugely. Her yawn concluding with a vacant exhalation, she now nibbled puppy-like on the snow-white tip of her dark brown tail, as though it itched. She did not appear to have the slightest inclination to be careful. Having introduced herself as a wolf and possessing these ears and this tail, Holo certainly relaxed with the carelessness of an animal, if nothing else. A slight vocalization that could have been a reply, or could simply have been a small utterance of satisfaction at having conquered the itch, reached Lawrence's ears. Tired of waiting for her reply, he looked forward again. Holo and Lawrence had met 2 weeks earlier. Owing to a strange event in one of the villages Lawrence stopped at, Holo had joined him, and the two had been traveling together since. With her ears and tail, she was currently regarded as an evil spirit, and the church sought to end her life to preserve order. Lawrence had not a shred of doubt that she was in fact a wolf, rather than a simple girl, who happened to have a wolf's ears and a tail. Just 9 days earlier, in the river town of Pazio, as a riot of silver chasing had come to a close, he had seen her true form. The huge brown wolf named Holo had understood human speech and possessed an overwhelming presence that was undeniably that of a god. Yet Lawrence believed his relationship with Holo the wise wolf to be one of money, of partners in lending and borrowing, of companions in travel, and of friends. He looked behind him again, and Holo appeared to be curled up in sleep. Although her legs were covered by the pants she wore under her robe, the robe was still hitched up around her waist from her earlier tail grooming, and there was no denying the fact that the sight was slightly lascivious. Her sleeping expression was the very picture of defenselessness, and coupled with her slight form, Holo looked less like a wolf and more like the sort of girl a wolf was likely to eat. Nevertheless, Lawrence did not take her lightly. Her wolf ears pricked suddenly, and she stirred, pulling her hood over her head and drawing the edge of her robe down to cover her tail. Lawrence looked ahead just as the road drew near the face of a hill and curved. Before them, the figure of a single merchant on foot could be seen. Cautioning Holo had indeed been unnecessary. Holo the wise wolf was hundreds of years old, and the young man's 25 years of experience were far from sufficient to make him her equal. However, Holo looked to be the younger of the two, with her true age being many times greater than what she appeared to be, a fact that occasionally irritated Lawrence. It was Lawrence's hope that Holo would act more in keeping with the apparent difference between their ages, obediently minding him when she was told. A variety of problems could have been avoided this way, and the wolf would have him to thank for this. But, unfortunately, the opposite was much more common. Lawrence glanced back at the cart bed once more. Despite the surreptitious nature of Lawrence's backward peek, Holo returned his look from where she lay, curled up around the bag of pepper. She threw him a mean-spirited grin as if to say that yes, she could see everything ahead just fine before closing her eyes once more. Lawrence looked back to the road. Perhaps enjoying the cart ride, Holo's tail flicked back and forth. The town ahead bore the strange name of Porosan. Beyond the town to the north and east, they would travel towards towns and villages that lay many days beyond the highlands in the foreground. The dress and food of the people would change. Even the gods worshipped would be different. The pair would find themselves in a truly foreign land. Lawrence had heard that Porosan was until recently known as a gateway to another world. Descending to the west of these rock-strewn highlands, one would find abundantly fertile, forested land in all directions. Yet the land, hemmed in as it was by the surrounding rocks, which yielded little spring water, was difficult to farm. The only reason to take the trouble of founding a town here was its position as this gateway to another world. They continued through the fields. Lawrence could hear the faint cries of goats through the morning haze as he counted the many gravestone-like posts he saw. The posts were carved with the names of many generations of sages and the church's long history, and continued to purify the land even now. Long before it was known as a gateway to another world, Porosan was a holy land to a certain pagan faith. Many years had passed since the church, following the will of its god, sent missionaries to convert the heathens, starting a war to purify this land tainted by impure beliefs. Porosan was a psychological turning point in the process of the destruction of the old faith. Once the church was on the verge of wiping out the pagan faith in the area, the priests commanded that a town be founded there. Porosan soon became the staging area for the missionaries and knights, heading north and east out of the remaining pagans. And it came to have a reputation as a crossroads for both goods and people. The missionaries with their tattered, hermit-like robes and the knights with righteous swords in hand, ready to reclaim land in the name of their god, were now gone. All that passed through the town these days were woven goods, salt, and iron from the north and east, and grain and leather from the south and west. The holy wars of the past were long gone, replaced by the continuous comings and goings of shrewd merchants. Holo's presence made it necessary for Lawrence to take roads with little traffic, but along certain ancient trade routes they continually passed carts laden with rare goods. Many of the textiles they saw were of particularly fine quality. Despite the brisk trade, Porosan was rather modest, thanks to the habits of its residents. The wealth of commerce provided for a magnificent wall around the town, but the buildings within it were of humble stone construction, their roofs thatched with straw. It's true that wherever goods and people intersect, money will be left behind and the area will prosper, but Porosan's circumstances were slightly different. The residents were all highly devout and gave most of their money to the church. Furthermore, Porosan was not the holding of a particular nation, but rather of the religious capital of Copenhagen to the northwest, so tithes did not stay in the town's own church, but instead flowed to the larger city. In fact, the church offices managed land taxes as well, so Porosan did not even control its own tax revenue. The residents of the town had no interest in anything beyond their own humble lives. When a bell sounded through the morning haze, the workers in the fields paused on their labors and turned to face the sound, putting their hands together and closing their eyes. In a typical town at this hour, red-faced merchants would be busy jockeying for position in the town square, but here there was no such rude commotion. Not wanting to intrude upon the residents' prayers, Lawrence stopped his cart horse. Then, putting his hands together, He offered a prayer to his own god. The bell rang a second time, and when the people returned to their work, Lawrence made his cart horse walk again. Suddenly, Holo spoke. "Oh, so you're a religious man now, are you? I'll pray to anyone who can promise me safe travels and tidy profits. I can promise you a fine harvest." Holo faced Lawrence as he glanced at her out of the corner of his eye. "You want me to pray to you, then?" Holo knew and hated the loneliness felt by gods. Lawrence believed she couldn't possibly be serious, but he ventured to ask. He suspected she was joking with him out of boredom. As expected, her reply came in a purposefully sweet voice. "Yes, I certainly do." "What shall I pray for, then?" asked Lawrence, by now used to this sort of treatment from Holo. "Whatever you like. I can provide a bountiful harvest, naturally, but safe travels are also no problem for me. I can predict the winds and rain, and tell whether spring water is good or bad, and I'm just the thing for getting rid of wolves and wild dogs." She sounded just like a village youth extolling his virtues to a merchant guild, but Lawrence thought for a moment before answering. "I suppose safe travels would be worth praying for." "They would they not?" answered Holo with a self-satisfied smile, inclining her head slightly. Seeing her carefree, innocent smile, Lawrence wondered whether she wasn't simply trying to praise her own abilities over the god of the church. Every once in a while, Holo exhibited a certain childishness. "Well, I suppose I'll ask for safe travels, then. It would be heartening to be able to avoid wolves." Safe travels, is it?" "Indeed." Lawrence tugged on the reins to avoid a donkey grazing on the grass. The gateway to the town walls would be upon them soon. The end of a line of people waiting for inspection was visible even in the morning mist. Though the entire town was part of the church, many merchants came to it from pagan lands, so Partisan was remarkably accommodating. Its inspection of goods was much stricter than its inspection of people. Lawrence was considering the tax likely to be levied on the pepper he carried when he became aware of someone looking at him from the side. There was only Holo. "What, is that all?" Her voice sounded slightly irritated. "I'm asking you if all you require is safe travel." Staring blankly at Holo for a few moments, Lawrence realized what she was talking about. "What, you wanted me to put my hands together and pray? Don't be ridiculous," she said with a vexed glare. "I'm guaranteeing you safe travel. Surely you don't think that a single useless prayer is compensation enough?" Lawrence's mind turned like a water wheel as he arrived at the obvious conclusion. "Ha! You want an offering?" Holo gave a self-satisfied chuckle. "What do you want?" "Dried mutton. You gorged yourself on the stuff yesterday. It must have been a week's worth that you ate." "I've always driven from mutton." Never shy, Holo licked her chops at the memory of the meat. It seemed even the noble wolf was a mere dog when presented with dried victuals. "Cooked meat is good too, but I simply cannot resist the texture of dried meat. If you pray for safe travels, dried mutton is the price." Holo's eyes blazed, and her tail switched restlessly underneath her robe. Lawrence ignored this completely, instead looking at the goods loaded on the horse that was being led by the merchant in front of them. The horse's back was piled high with a mountain of wool. "What about that wool? Is it good or bad?" Wool evidently suggested sheep. Holo looked at the mountain of wool, her eyes brimming with anticipation, before answering quickly. "It is quite good. So good I can almost sell the grass they ate." "I thought as much. My pepper should fetch a good price here." If the wool was of high quality, the meat would be excellent, too, and as the quality of meat rose, so did its price. Expensive meat made his pepper, which could be used to flavor and preserve it, all the more valuable, and Lawrence began to look forward to selling his wares. Also, dried meat with lots of salt is good. Just a little bit of salt will not do. Also, meat from the flanks is the best, better than meat from the legs. Here now, are you listening? Salted meat from the flanks. You have excellent taste. That'll cost us. Ha! 'Tis a bargain at twice the price. It was true that some good mutton was a bargain if it meant Holo would guarantee safe travels. After all, her true form was a giant talking wolf. She could probably even protect him from the kind of ill-mannered soldiers that were hard to distinguish from out-and-out thieves. Nonetheless, Lawrence assumed a purposefully blank expression as he regarded Holo. Her eyes were fixed greedily upon the imagined food. He couldn't help but tease her. "Well now, you must have quite a bit of money indeed. If you've got so much, perhaps you should repay me." Yet his opponent was a canny, wise wolf. She soon discerned his motive. Her demeanor tightened suddenly as she glared at him. "That approach will no longer work." Apparently she had learned from the apple incident. Lawrence clicked his tongue in irritation, his face grim. You should have just asked nicely in the first place, then. It would have been so much more charming. So if I ask charmingly enough, you will buy some for me, then? Asked Holo without a trace of charm. Lawrence eased the horse forward as the line moved, answering flatly. Of course not. You could stand to learn something from those cows and sheep. Try chewing your cud, He grinned to himself, proud of his wit. But Holo's face went blank with anger, and without a word, there on the driver's seat of the wagon, she stomped on his foot. The road was nothing more than hard-packed dirt, the simple houses made of rough-hewn stone and thatched with grass. The people of Porison bought nothing but the barest necessities from the merchant stalls, so there were surprisingly few such stalls. A goodly number of people moved about the town, among them merchants with carts or backs fully loaded, but the atmosphere seemed to suck up the normal town chatter like cotton, so it was oddly quiet. It was hard to believe this quiet, simple, proud town was a nexus of foreign trade that earned dizzying amounts of money every day. After all, missionaries whose street-corner sermons went largely ignored in other cities could count on gratefully attentive crowds here. So how was profit so effectively made? To Lawrence, the town was nothing less than a mystery. "'Tis a tedious place," came Holo's assessment of the uniquely religious town. "You're only saying that because there's nothing to eat." "You speak as though I think of nothing else. Shall we take in a sermon, then?" Just ahead of them, a missionary preached to a crowd, one hand on a book of scripture. The listeners were not only townspeople. There were several merchants whose prayers were normally for naught but their own profit. Holo regarded them distastefully and sniffed. "He is about 500 years too young to be preaching to me. I dare say you could stand to hear a sermon on frugality." Toying idly with the silken sash at her waist, Holo put her hand to her mouth and yawned at Lawrence's suggestion. "I'm a wolf yet. Sermons are complicated and difficult for us to understand," she said shamelessly, rubbing her eyes. "Well, as far as the teachings of the god of frugality go, they're more persuasive here than anywhere else, I'd reckon. Nearly all the money made here flows to the seat of the church northwest of here, Reuvenhagen. Now there's a place I've no desire to hear a sermon." The church capital of Reuvenhagen was so prosperous some said its walls had turned to gold. The upper echelons of the church council that controlled the region had turned to commerce, to support their subjugation of the heathens, and the priests and bishops of Reuvenhagen put the merchants to shame. Lawrence wondered if that was precisely why opportunities for profit there were so absurdly plentiful. Just then, Holo tilted her head quizzically. "Did you say Reuvenhagen?" "What, do you know it?" Lawrence gave Holo a sidelong glance as he steered the wagon to the right once the street forked. I remember the name, but not as a city. It was a person's name." "Ah, you're not wrong. It's a city now, but it was the name of a saint who led a group of crusaders against the pagans. It's an old name. You don't hear much any more." "Maybe 'tis him I'm remembering." "Surely not." Lawrence laughed it off, but soon realized. Holo had set out on her travels hundreds of years ago. "He was a man with flaming red hair and a great bushy beard. He'd hardly gotten a glance at my lovely ears and tail before he set his knights after me with spear and sword. I'd had enough, so I took my other form and kicked his knights around before sinking my teeth into that Reuvenhagen's backside. He was rather lean and far from tasty." Holo sniffed proudly as she related the gallant tale. The surprised Lawrence had no response. In the holy city of Reuvenhagen, there were records of Saint Reuvenhagen having red hair, and the city itself having originally been a fortress that fought against pagan gods. However, in his battles against the heathen deities, Saint Reuvenhagen was said to have lost his left arm. That is why on the great mural in the city cathedral he was pictured with no left arm, his ragged clothing smeared with blood, resolutely ordering his crusaders forward against the pagans, the protection of God at their backs. Perhaps the reason Saint Reuvenhagen was always pictured in clothes so ragged he might as well be nude was because Holo had shredded them. Her true form was that of a massive wolf, after all. It was easy to imagine her bloodying someone after a bit of sport. If what Holo said was true, Saint Reuvenhagen had probably been ashamed of being bitten on his rear and had omitted that bit from the story. In that case, the tale of the saint losing his left arm is pure fabrication. Had Holo bitten the real Saint Reuvenhagen? Hearing the story behind the history, Lawrence chuckled. "Oh, but wait a moment," said Holo. "I only bit him, I'll have you know. I did not kill him," said Holo quickly, anticipating Lawrence's reaction. For a moment, Lawrence didn't understand what she was getting at, but soon he realized. She must have assumed he would be angry if she killed one of his fellow humans. "You're considerate at the strangest of times," said Lawrence. "'Tis important," said Holo, her face serious enough that Lawrence capitulated without any further teasing. "Anyway, this surely is a tedious city. The middle of the forest is livelier than this. I'll unload my pepper, pick up a new commodity, and we'll be on our way to Reuvenhagen, so just bear it until then. Is it a big town?" "Bigger even than Pasio. More properly a city than a town, really. It's crowded, and there are lots of shops." Holo's face lit up. "With apples, even?" "Hard to say if they'll be fresh. With winter coming, I'd think they'd be preserved." "Preserved?" said Holo, dubious. In the Northlands, salt was the only method of preservation, so she assumed preserved apples would also use salt. "They use honey," said Lawrence. Pop went Holo's ears, flicking rapidly under the hood she wore. "Pear preserves are good too. Also, they're a bit rare, but I've seen preserved peaches. Now those are fine goods. They slice the peaches thin, pack them in a cask with the odd layer of almonds or figs, then fill up the spaces with honey, and seal it shut. Takes about 2 months for it to be ready to eat. I've only had it once, but it was so sweet the church was considering banning the stuff." "Hey, you're drooling." Holo snapped her mouth shut as Lawrence pointed it out. She took a nervous glance around, and then looked back at Lawrence dubiously. You're toying with me, though." "Can't you tell if I'm lying or not?" Holo set her jaw, perhaps at a loss for words. "I'm not lying, but there's no telling whether they'll actually have the preserves. They're mostly for rich nobles anyway. The stuff isn't just lined up in a shop." "But if it is?" Swish, swish. Holo's tail was itching back and forth beneath her robe so rapidly it almost seemed like a separate animal altogether. Her eyes were moist and blurred with overflowing anticipation. Holo's face was so close to Lawrence that she rested her head on his shoulder. Her eyes were desperately serious. "Fine, fine, I'll buy you some." Holo gripped Lawrence's arm tightly. "You have to." He felt that if he looked sideways at her, he'd be bitten on the spot. "A little, though, just a little," Lawrence said. It was not clear if Holo was listening or not. "That's a promise, then. You've promised." "Okay, okay." "So let us hurry on, then. Hurry, now." "Stop grabbing me." Lawrence shrugged her off, but Holo's mind had wandered elsewhere. She seemed to look off into the distance and muttered as she nibbled on the tail of her middle finger. "They may sell out. Should it come to that." Lawrence was beginning to regret having said anything about honeyed peach preserves, but it was too late for such regrets. If he dared to suggest he had decided to not buy any after all, it seemed likely she'd tear out his throat. It didn't matter that honeyed peach preserves weren't something that traveling merchants could afford. "It's not a question of selling out. They may not have any at all," Lawrence said. "Just understand that." "We are talking about peaches and honey, sir. It beggars belief. Peaches and honey." "Are you even listening to me?" "Still, it's hard to give up pears," said Holo, turning to Lawrence and looking up at him. Lawrence's only reply was to heave a long-suffering sigh. Lawrence planned to sell his pepper to the Latperin Trading Company, whose name was every bit as odd as the town in which it was located, Poroson. If one were to trace the name, it would surely harken all the way back to the time before Poroson was a town, and only pagans inhabited the area. The strange names were all that remained of the past, though. After all, everyone here was a true believer in the church, from the tops of their heads to the tips of their toes. The Latperin Trading Company would soon have its 50th master, and each seemed to be more devout than the last. Thus it was that no sooner had Lawrence called upon the company, which he'd not visited in half a year, than he was regaled with praise for the newly arrived priest, whose sermons he simply had to hear, as would they not save our very souls? Still worse, the master of the Latperin Company seemed to take Holo in her robes for a nun on pilgrimage, and exhorted her to minister to Lawrence as well. Holo took the opportunity to rail at Lawrence at length, occasionally grinning in a way that only he could see. After some time, their preaching ended, and Lawrence swore to himself that he wouldn't spare so much as a single coin for any honey peach preserves. "Well then, that went a bit long, but shall we talk business now?" "I await your pleasure," said Lawrence, clearly tired, but the Latperin master had put on his business face now, so Lawrence couldn't let his guard down. It was possible that the master's lengthy sermon was a tactic to wear his opponents down, making them easy prey. "So, what goods have you brought me this day?" "Right here," said Lawrence, regaining his composure and bringing out the pepper-stuffed sack. "Oh, pepper!" Lawrence kept hidden his surprise at the master's correct guess of the bag's contents. "You know your goods," he said. "It's the smell," said the master with a mischievous smile. But Lawrence knew pepper yet to be ground has little scent. Lawrence stole a sidelong glance at Holo, who looked on amused. "It seems I'm still a novice," said Lawrence. "Just a matter of experience," said the master. As far as Lawrence could tell from the man's broad, easy manner, his mistaking Holo for a nun might also have been an act. "Still, Mr. Lawrence, you always bring the best goods at the most opportune time. By God's grace, the hay grew well this year, and the pork has gotten fat merely walking the streets. Demand for pepper will be high for a while. Had you gotten here even a week sooner, I'd have been able to take it off your hands for a pittance." Lawrence could only offer a pained smile in response to the cheerful man. The Laperon master had taken complete control of the conversation. He could now use strong-arm negotiating tactics. It would be hard for Lawrence to regain the upper hand. Traders like these in small companies were why the life of the merchant was a hard one. "Right then, let's take its measure. Have you a scale?" Unlike the money changers whose reputations depended on the accuracy of their scales, the scales that merchants carried were doctored as a matter of course. With commodities like pepper or gold dust, a small adjustment to a scale's gradations could make a large difference, so both buyer and seller weighed items on their own scales. However, it wasn't every day that Lawrence dealt with high-priced goods like pepper, so he had no scales. "No, I don't have a scale. I trust in God." The master smiled and nodded at Lawrence's reply. There were 2 sets of scales on a shelf, and he deliberately brought out the set farther away. Though he was careful not to show it, Lawrence internally sighed in relief. Be he the most devout, faithful follower of the teachings of the Church, a merchant was still a merchant. Undoubtedly, the first set of scales had been doctored. If Lawrence's pepper was weighed on such scales, there was no telling how much of a loss he might sustain. It could be as bad as a silver piece for every peppercorn. Lawrence gave God his thanks. Even if you believe in a just God, man should be able to discern whether the scripture before him is true or false. A righteous man still trespasses against God if he commits to memory false scripture after all, said the master, setting the scales down on a nearby table. He was probably trying to reassure Lawrence that his scales were accurate. Although merchants were always trying to outsmart one another, that didn't mean trust was never necessary. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," said Lawrence, at which point the master nodded and took a step back. On the table was a beautiful set of brass scales, which gleamed a dull gold. It was the sort of set one would expect to see in the offices of a wealthy campist in a large city, and seemed a bit out of place in this shop. The Laperon Trading Company's storefront was so plain it was easily mistakable for a simple home, and the only employees were the master and a few men. The interior of the shop was also plainly furnished, with 2 shelves situated against the wall, one holding jars that seemed to contain spices or dried foodstuffs, and another holding bundles of documents, paper, and parchment. While the scales seemed not in keeping with the rest of the shop, the balance of those scales was clear. The scales balanced in the center with plates of counterweights to the left and right. They did not seem to have been tampered with. Relieved, Lawrence looked up and smiled. "Shall we proceed to weigh the pepper, then?" There was no reason not to. "Let's see. We'll need paper and ink. Wait just a moment, please," said the master, walking to the corner of the room and retrieving an inkpot and paper from the shelf. Lawrence was idly looking on when a tug at his sleeve pulled him out of his reverie. There was no one else there. It was Holo. "What is it? I'm thirsty." "You'll have to wait," said Lawrence shortly, but he immediately reconsidered. She was Holo the Wise Wolf, after all. She wouldn't make a complaint like that out of the blue. There had to be some kind of reason behind it. Having changed his mind, Lawrence was about to ask her to explain herself, and the master spoke again. "Even the saints themselves needed water to live. Would you like water, or perhaps wine?" "Water, if you please," said Holo with a smile. Evidently she had only been thirsty after all. "Just a moment, then." The master left the contract paper, ink and quill on the table, and walked out of the room, going to fetch the water himself. In this regard he seemed to be no merchant, but the model of a devout adherent of the Church. Yet even as Lawrence was impressed at the master's faith, he gave Holo a sidelong glare. "I know this may seem nothing like you, but to us merchants this is a battleground. You could have had as much water as you wanted later." "But I am thirsty," said Holo, looking away stubbornly. She hated being scolded. Despite her frightening intelligence, she could be strangely childish at times. There was no point in saying anything more. Lawrence sighed, and to chase away his frustration with Holo, he set his mind on estimating how much pepper he had. At length the master returned, carrying a wooden tray with an iron pitcher and cup. Lawrence's shame at having made a business associate and an elder perform such a menial task was very real, but the master's smiling face seemed to have dispensed with business for the moment. "Well then, shall we proceed with the way?" "Indeed."